Right.
Okay, the session will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and thanks very much to Sana for assisting with the presentations. So the seminar itself will explore insufficient exposure of Asian British artists in exhibitions and other projects. The seminar will also consider the reasons why, including racism and misogyny from within and outside Asian British cultures. The seminar will identify strategies for redressing this imbalance with input from artists, curators, and writers who have a leading role in the development of contemporary art through their practice and would present their unique perspectives and experiences. The seminar will raise awareness of issues and facilitate development of exhibitions and symposia, showcasing work by Asian British artists, including a consideration of this group not being a hermetically sealed group. This Interworld seminar has arisen from our British Art Network funded Shai, Asian British art with a focus on South Asian and East Asian contemporary women artist practice research group, aiming to address the underrepresentation of Asian British women artists in exhibitions and challenge their underrepresentation and invisibility in the British art world. Our focus is to shed light on the systematic barriers, including racism and misogyny, that prevent these artists from gaining equal exposure and recognitions within the visual arts. Through reading groups and films readings, performance, workshops, and we aim to create thinking spaces that will unpack notions of invisibility and disenchantment and identity strategies for redressing this imbalance. And as a research group, we believe that disenchantment and invisibility are not simply a result of a lack of exposure or representation, but are deeply rooted in systemic inequalities and power dynamics. Our research group tends to challenge these dynamics to contribute to a more inclusive and equitable art world, which in itself is crucial for the growth and advancement of British cultural landscape. By bringing together artists, writers, curators, academics, and researchers, we aim to generate new channels of thinking and networking that will contribute towards the development of British art, curating, for example, in generating material and networks leading to a new exhibition of contemporary artist work. And the project will be archived within the Slade School of Fine Art. Bindu will now kindly introduce Alice Correia.
Thank you, Jasmine, for a wonderful introduction to our group and our objectives. So I'm going to briefly speak about Dr. Alice Correia. Dr. Alice Correia is an art historian, writer, and curator. She received a doctorate in art history from the University of Sussex in 2006, where she taught undergraduate and postgraduate art history students from 2006 to 2012. She's a specialist in late 20th century British art with a focus on Black and South Asian artists and utilizes feminist and post-decolonial perspectives. She has worked at Tate Britain Government Art Collection and Touchstone Rochdale. She has held fellowships at the Paul Mellon Center for the Study of British Art and the UEL Decolonizing Art Institute. Her edited anthology, What is Black Art? Writings on Artists of African, Asian, and Caribbean Heritage in Britain, 1981 to 1989, was published by Penguin in September 2022, and she co-curated the exhibition, A Tall Order, Rochdale Art Gallery in the 1980s at Touchstone Rochdale from February to May 2023. Alice will introduce her ongoing research into the neglected histories of British Asian artistic practice during the 1980s and 90s, focusing on the work of women artists. What types of art did this generation make? Where was it shown and how was it understood? She will provide a historical sketch of some of the key exhibitions, activities, and publications, as well as identify and discuss some key artists and their work. While some artists from the 1980s generation include Zarina Bhimji, Sutapa Biswas, and Chilakumari Burman have received significant curatorial and critical attention in recent years, there are many other artists who have yet to receive such recognition. Alice will introduce some of her research about brilliant but understudied artists, including Niloufar Ahmed, Simran Patti, and Mohini Chandra. Thank you, Alice, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that brilliant introduction. I'll share my screen. So I don't need to introduce myself because it's been done so wonderfully. So yeah, today I'm going to give you an overview of some of my research and look at in greater detail some of the artists that I've been researching. So in 2014, I initiated an ongoing research project entitled Articulating British South Asian Art Histories. The aim of the project was to undertake new primary and secondary research into the contributions made by South Asian diaspora artists in Britain during the 1980s and 90s. And my objective was to gain a richer understanding of the aesthetic and political aims of the South Asian diaspora artists and the context in which they were working. So overarching my research focus is an interest in and a concern for the narrative trajectory and composition of the history of British art, the definition of this thing that we call the Black Arts movement of the 1980s, and the place of South Asian artists within those narratives. So since, and this on screen are just some of the archival materials that I've been assembling through various visits to different archives across the country over the last few years. So since starting my project, I've published a number of journal articles and have written commissioned exhibition catalogue essays. And the time frame of my research has widened slightly. In 2020, I published some research about the historicisation and the representation of South Asian modernist painters working in post-war London. But moving forward, I'm currently preparing a book manuscript focusing on women artists of South Asian heritage working in Britain. But I'll just, with a little bit of background and context. So during the 1980s, the archive tells us, and indeed published literature and more things are becoming increasingly available, recorded talks and so on. It demonstrates that there were active collaborations and productive allegiances between so-called Afro-Asian artistic constituencies during the 1980s. Exhibitions such as Black Women, Time Now and Revelations in Black sought not only to offer opportunities to exhibit work, reach new audiences and construct new critical vocabularies, but inherently presented collaborations and networks between artists from different backgrounds, even when the artworks themselves appeared to have little or no common thread. However, when I started thinking about the ways that Black art in Britain was being historicised, particularly that work from the 1980s, I was also thinking about the silences, who was included and who was excluded, whose version of Black British art history is being prioritised. Stuart Hall identified that although many artists found that there was benefit in creating cross-cultural political allegiances under the sign of Blackness, such an essentialized identification also enacted silences. While Black was useful and important as a collective identifier within an anti-racist struggle, it didn't always allow for a nuanced understanding of cultural difference. And Hall later suggested that the term Black, quote, had a certain way of silencing the very specific experiences of Asian people. So when thinking about the presence of South Asian artists within narratives of Black British art history, Rashida Reen's work as an artist, curator and scholar is centrally important. As I'm sure you're all aware, his 1989 exhibition, The Other Story, Afro-Asian Artists in Post-War Britain, and its attendant catalogue remain, for many scholars, myself included, an important point of departure when studying diaspora artists in Britain. However, while 10 of the 24 artists included in the exhibition were of South Asian origin, all of those artists were men, and at the time of the exhibition, all of them were aged 40 or above. And writing in the feminist magazine Spare Rib, the artist and archivist Rita Keegan observed that, quote, no Asian women were included, and by that she means South Asian women. So thinking pragmatically, the omission of South Asian women from the other story was a consequence of Irene's decision to set parameters on who was eligible for inclusion. By focusing exclusively on fine art mediums, painting, sculpture, and to a lesser degree, photography, Irene excluded craft practices, including textiles and ceramics. So this decision meant that the ceramicist Vinodini Ebden was automatically excluded. And here you've got a page from the exhibition catalogue, New Horizons, with a photograph of the artist and some of her pottery. And in addition, the art historian Jean Fisher recalled that Irene's selection for the other story was such that he only included artists resident in the UK for at least 10 years. In his postscript to the catalogue, Irene acknowledged that most migrant women artists who travelled to Britain in the 1950s and 60s returned to their respective homelands or nations after completing their studies in the UK, and were thus excluded from possible selection, regardless of their impact on the broader artistic ecosystem in the UK. However, it's arguable that an artist such as Shashi Mehra could have been included in the other story. Mehra was born in Peshawar, now in Pakistan, in 1933, and studied at the Slade School of Art between 1958 and 1961. And she exhibited alongside Anwar Jalal Shemza at the Commonwealth Artists Exhibition at Woodstock Gallery, London in 1960. I lose trace of her in the archive after about this 1960 exhibition, but she turns up again in the early 1980s when she had a solo show at the Playhouse Gallery in Harlow, Essex in 1981. Professor Dawn Addis and Michael Podrow, who were at that point members of the art history department at the University of Essex, wrote short texts for her exhibition pamphlet at that time. And also in 1982, she contributed to a group exhibition of South Asian artists called Between Two Cultures, organised by the artist collective Indian Artists UK, staged at the Barbican in 1982. Then later in 1989, she had a solo show at Queen Elizabeth Hall on the South Bank Centre in London, curated by John Gill. I've yet to find an example of her work in a UK public collection, but the South Bank archives do hold transparencies of her swirling, fluid landscapes. You can see some of that here. From these transparencies, there's a painting of the Red Fort, there are a painting of women washing in the Ganges, and there's also a painting of a woman or a person dressed in red walking through a sort of a lush garden landscape or wooded landscape. From these transparencies and from the various pamphlets in the archives, it appears that she approached the depiction of Indian and English landscapes in much the same way, with daubs of paint gesturing to trees, buildings, and distant figures. And my sense is that she was interested in how people and place might exist harmoniously. After her show at Queen Elizabeth Hall, I lose trace of her and I haven't been able to find out what's happened to her. So if anyone knows, I'd be really interested to find out. Now, Shashi Mehra belongs to an older generation of post-war migrant artists. The 1980s saw the emergence of a younger generation of South Asian women artists, filmmakers and educationalists who were driven by personal and political desires to challenge hegemonic visual discourses in Britain. And you may well be aware of the work of Zarina Bimji, Shubha Biswas and Shaila Kumari Burman, who have gained recognition and have been doing fabulous exhibitions more recently. But for the remainder of my time, I'd like to highlight the work of Nilofer Akmat, Simrath Patti and Mohini Chandra, all of whom are included in the book Beyond Frontiers, edited by Amal Ghosh and Joginder Lambert. This book was published in around 2000, and it remains the only book on South Asian diaspora artists in Britain. So I want to discuss some of their work in detail, ever mindful of Cobham Mercer's warning that when discussing artists of colour, there is or has been, quote, chaos and confusion as to what the primary object of attention actually is. Is it the background information about the artist's cultural identity, or the foreground matter of the aesthetic work performed by the object itself? So as Mercer went on to argue, the bibliographical should lead into an exploration of, quote, the deeper structures of diaspora subjectivity that it opens onto, end quote. So that while an artist's subject experience may have motivated a particular strand of artistic inquiry, this is not to say that the resultant artwork is wholly or even partially autobiographical. So rather than reducing discussion of an artwork to an exposition of an artist's racial or ethnic identity, a productive balance must be found in order to consider those contextual factors in dialogue with the formal strategies and material qualities of the art object. So Beyond Frontiers was the belated book published essentially to mark the South Asian Visual Arts Festival, curated by Jaginder Lamba and staged between September and December 1993. The festival exhibited over 50 artists in 18 venues across the West Midlands. And at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, they staged the exhibition Transition of Riches, which showed a group show of contemporary British South Asian artists. The works weren't linked stylistically, but the exhibition just sought to give a snapshot of contemporary practice. So I'll just highlight two of the artists in that show. Niloufar Ahmed studied at the National College of Arts in Lahore and then in London during the 1980s at Byamshaw School of Art, the Slade and Royal Holloway. It was during her time in London that she was exposed to feminist theory. And although she initially trained as a sculptor, she became interested in the possibilities of photography while working as an assistant to Joe Spence. For Transition of Riches, Ahmed installed a multi-part, multi-sensory installation that included photography, sculpture, light and sound, and which explored the histories of the Indian independence movement and the subsequent partition of the subcontinent in 1947, all from a feminist perspective. Positioned in a corridor-like area within Birmingham Art Gallery, Ahmed made use of the transitionary and divided space by creating oppositions. On one wall was a light box showing an inverted map of the Indian subcontinent, positioned above three large colour photographs of fire taken during a performance by the artist in Germany, and sculptural elements were also included in a vitrine, which you can see in the image. On the opposite wall was a documentary image of Gandhi on the Salt March of April 1930, together with black and white photographs of the scene near Karachi. The images were linked by tubes of salt mounted on the wall, while sacks of salt were positioned on the ground in front. Ahmed has explained that the work was her attempt, quote, at improving my understanding of the experience of people who were violently dislocated, suffered from politics of pain, and the conflicting loyalties of migrants from one land to another, end quote. Throughout the installation was a concern for the role of women in the independence movement and the ways in which their stories have been omitted from history. I would suggest that in this installation, Ahmed's using the conceptual strategies of the serial image, the found image, image and text, but unlike the conceptual artists of the 1960s, who asserted theirs as a neutral or detached photography, Ahmed does not seek to jettison cultural context from her application of conceptual forms. Instead, her work reflects the evolution of conceptual art to conceptualism, where the latter term describes artworks that use conceptual strategies, but which also function as an act of political engagement. Using modes of conceptual photography informed by identity politics, She addresses the structures and spaces of power through which the female diasporic subject navigates. To follow Okwe, her work, quote, acts like, looks like, and resembles those practices of conceptual art, but refuses to adopt its claim to objectivity and a detached, disinterested stance. One of the other artists included in Transition of Riches was Simrath Patti. Simrath was an artist. She studied in Leeds in the early 1980s, and after her degree, she moved back to London, her home, and she curated important exhibitions, including Jagrati, an exhibition of 13 Asian women held at the Greenwich Citizens Gallery in Woolwich in 1986. In the Transition of Riches, Simrath included her large-scale installation Cherchez les Femmes, which also, and the critic Tanya Gura has described the work as, quote, a complex multi-layered installation that examines the fissures between represented and real femininity. So briefly, the installation comprised of a room set up like a 1970s living room with a sofa and this florid wallpaper. And she also included sculptures from Birmingham's collection of Queen Victoria and Rabindranath Tagore. On the walls were videos in which Patti or Simrath explores sensuality and male sexuality, and that was played across 3 screens. The video showed gay Rani dancers doing movements and addressed what we now describe as queer culture, and ideas about cross-dressing and performance. In the middle of all of this was a bowl of mangoes, which over the course of the exhibition were left to rot, so that a number of reviews mentioned the sensation of moving into a space and being hit by the smell of overripe and rotting fruit. I'm still undertaking research into Simrath's work, but there's lots more to say about gender and representation about that installation. But I'll, for now, alert you to a podcast that I made with Simrath in 2021, when I was a research fellow at the Decolonising Arts Institute, and she discusses Cherchez les Femmes in some detail. And the last artist I'd just like to briefly talk about is Mohini Chandra. Mohini wasn't in Transition of Riches, but she was in the multi-venue arts festival Independent Thoughts in 1997, which was also co-curated by Jaginda Lamba. So that's how she ended up being in the Beyond Frontiers book. The Independent Thoughts Festival marked the 50th anniversary of the independence of India and Pakistan from British rule, and took place in venues across the northern region, Blue Coat in particular, in Liverpool, sorry. But since her time at the Royal College of Arts in the 1990s, Mohini Chandra has considered issues including forced colonial and post-colonial migrations and subsequent questions of belonging and how they might be articulated through the photographic object. In Independent Thoughts, Mohini exhibited the work, the multi-installation work, Travels in a New World too, and I'll say a bit about that in a minute. But just as context, Chandra's ancestors originated from India, but her immediate family lived and were born in Fiji, while she was born in Britain and raised in Australia. Chandra's written about her family's history as indentured labourers from India who were transported by the British to Fiji to work in the sugar plantations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And although it seems likely that her ancestors originated from either Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, scarce and incomplete records mean that it's unlikely that she'll ever know where in India her family were from. The complexities of this global Fiji Indian diaspora, of which Mohini is part, encourages us to think about South Asian diasporas differently, I think. As she herself has observed, quote, despite your appearance to the outside world, India is as a home is an imaginary mythical concept, end quote. Instead of family in or stories about an Indian homeland, Arguably, what links Mohini to a heterogeneous and globally dispersed South Asian diaspora is a shared experience of British colonialism, violent post-colonial independence, post-independence displacement, and racism in the place of settlement. Members of her extended family now reside across the globe, and in Travels in the New World too, she explores that dispersal. The work comprises 5 colour video projections transferred from Super 8 film, projected simultaneously. Each depicts a member of her family standing on a beach with the Pacific Ocean behind them, but they are variously located in Australia, Canada, Malaysia, and the USA. Installed in the round, each film is projected adjacent to each other, so it gives the impression that the protagonists are in fact standing next to each other, rather than separated by many thousands of miles of water. Each film has its own soundtrack so that multiple voices overlap, as each contributor discusses the same family photograph, which is also projected in the installation, and recounts their memories of the family together in Fiji. Each speaker tentatively identifies Fiji as home, but homeland is tacitly acknowledged as, but coming home, is tacitly acknowledged as an impossibility. So what's striking about Mohini's work is that she expresses complexity and heterogeneity of South Asian diasporas created by numerous historical coercive dispersals and ejections, so that identity can no longer be conceived of in terms of a single homeland, but rather it exists in an area of floating identifications. Here, new nomadic trans identities coalesce around shared experiences of displacement, racism, and imaginary Indias. So formed perhaps in the in-between, I think her work conveys a sense, conveys the experience of migration not as a journey with a start or end point, but rather as a state of being. And I'll just conclude with a quote by the art historian W.J.T. Mitchell, who's observed that, quote, "The most salient fact about migration in our time is the way that it has become not a transitional passage from one place to another, but a permanent condition in which people may live out their lives in a limbo." Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. That was such a thoughtful and brilliant presentation, really very moving as well. So I'm really, really looking forward to further conversations on this topic with you and the rest of the people. But now I welcome our new speaker, Bhajan Hunjan, and over to you, Bhajan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this online Interworld seminar held at the Slade UCL. Slade has a very special place in my heart, as I was a postgraduate student in the printmaking department from 79 to 81, and later worked as a teaching assistant in the lithography from 87 to 91. And I also want to thank Slade School UCL for congratulating me on social media for being shortlisted for the Max Mara Art Prize 22-24, which was an honor. So when I had 2 curators visit my studio from Whitechapel Gallery after the shortlisting, I was asked if I had gallery representation. And the answer was no, I don't have a gallery. Did you ever have a gallery? No, I never had a gallery. And the second was that if my work was in the Arts Council collection. And no, that was another answer, no. So really that actually maybe is interesting that after 4 decades of my being a practicing artist in Britain, and now in my 60s, so, you know, it's quite an interesting reflection on what's happening. Anyway, so I think having said that, I still have a lot to be thankful for, which includes, you know, what I've learned from my ancestors, which is the resilience, the perseverance, and the belief in hard work and faith of our ancestors, really. Having migrated, in my case, from India to East Africa. And also, you know, the paths which have been laid down for us by the Indian artists who arrived in Britain post-partition and who formed organizations, shared their passion. And I was one of the younger artists that was, that received their kind of wonderful energies. So some background about myself is that I come from a family of Punjabi Indian Sikhs, with my grandfather who emigrated to the British East Africa in 1933. And so part of my family moved to UK after the Africanization and the Kenyanization plan, which was introduced in 1964 in Kenya. And that was because we all held some kind of British protectorate passports, and none of us could then, unless we took up citizenship, or in case of business people, unless they had an African Kenyan partner, you couldn't really work in Kenya. So that was when I think the first migration of Asian families was to UK. So I arrived in Reading, the Reading University, to study fine art. Now that's quite interesting because I already had family here. My brother lived in Reading and my sister lived in Leeds. So that means I could only apply to those two places. We all know about how protective the Asian parents are. So it would have been, quite interesting if I'd been offered a place anywhere else. But anyway, it was wonderful to be in Reading. So at Reading, I studied printmaking and painting, and also met up with wonderful, wonderful people along the way. But as we all know, the history of art schools around that time, it was largely all male tutors. And we did have one or two visitors like Susie Goblick, which is, I still remember, which was brilliant, an American artist. So we always had some wonderful visiting artists who came. So, and you all know anxieties of parents, irrespective of background, when their child opts to go to an art school, as to what will you do later on? How are you going to earn a living and get a proper job? So for me, I always felt that coming from a family of makers, and printmaking was something that became my passion. I spent a lot of time in the printmaking department, and I would always tell them, well, I can always teach, really, if nothing else happens within the art world. So at the end of my time in Reading, I actually met up with Arpana Kaur, who was visiting from India. She had a one-person show at Gallery 38, which at the time was being run by Maria Souza. And so it was just, for me, she was the first Indian woman artist I had met. And we met at the Serpentine Gallery because Balraj Khanna was showing there as part of a group show. And we just there was magnetism between us, and everybody else disappeared. And we just kind of talked about things. But that also, through that meeting, I met up with other members of Indian artist group. That included Avtarjit Danjal, Amal Ghosh. Amal Ghosh, later on, I worked with him at the Central School when I was a student at the Slade, and other people. So being at the Slade was also a wonderful experience because the printmaking department at the time also was an international hub. It was headed by Barto dos Santos, and who was Portuguese. And also there were always students from India and Pakistan on British Council grant. So I met people like Nazish, I met people like, Afshar Malik and other people who came from Pakistan. But anyway, that was a bit later on. All the same, it was a wonderful space to be in. And again, during my time at the Slade, I was part of a group that was trying to get more women tutors to teach at the Slade, because at that time there wasn't any. So I'm talking about 1979 to 81. But the person I did meet was Shaila Kumari Burman. She was a year below me. And so we spent a year together. And it was wonderful to be with her. And through her, I met up with the Asian Women Writers Collective. in London, and I also met up with a group of women from Reading who were trying to form an Asian women's refuge. So on my return back to Reading, in '83, I went back to university to do a PGC because I still wanted to be a teacher, my fallback position. But also, I actually got really involved with the Sahara Asian Women's Group, and then spent almost 5 years. I was a worker there as well, and worked with women and children and families. So that for me was like a real opener. So here I'm going to share my screen with you, and so share some of my images and show you some of the kind of work which I was doing at the time. So these are some of my prints from around end of '79 to '80s, and in the late '80s, I also then met up with more of Indian artist group, who then were offered a space in the basement of Nehru Art Center, and as Alice has already mentioned, co-curated some of the shows. One of the first one was the 4 Indian women artists, and after that, a co-curated Numayish, and then was invited by Simrat to help with the Jagrati show, where we had the 13 women artists. So I'm just going to show you some more images here of some of the work I was doing, which were making these huge, large paintings with sawdust. And then being at Sahara was a time, which is the refuge, was a time when I started thinking much more about imagery of Asian women, and how it was 2 things. One was thinking about the women that I worked with, but also myself. I think looking at our limitations, looking at, so I went back to figurative portraiture work, but also looking at some of the barriers and the limitations which existed within us and within our conditioning that we had inherited, through our culture, and also the barriers which were outside. So it was this kind of conflict between the outside and the inside, but also started looking at the work that women made in their domestic spaces, which were the embroideries and the crochet work, and the kind of very popular, like the paisley symbol, and so combining them with portraiture. But what also became important for me around this time was the gaze, the idea of a woman looking out. Obviously, we'd seen Frida Kahlo's, but it was a take on that, but also looking at sort of trying to create my own kind of symbolic language. But the gaze was really important. It was about a woman looking out, not in a passive way, but in a much more challenging way, but her presence was there in a very strong way. And so around that time, this brings me to around 1985 to 90s, I had a one-person show around this time. In '89 was a really interesting time for me at the Horizon Gallery. So the Ayuk Indian artist group then had a space, which was the Horizon Gallery, but also I had a show at South Hill Park, and which were group shows, and at Aspects Gallery. So here what I've got is some of the exhibitions which happened at the time. Now, I don't know whether you can see the whole screen or whether the icons are actually limiting some of the vision. Can everybody see the screen all right? So these were some of the one-person and the group exhibitions that I had. And also there was an article, an interview of Shaila and myself published in Framing Feminism by Rosika Parker and Griselda Pollack, which was first published in Spare Rib. And you've already seen some of these images in Alice's talk. And I'd also met up with Maud Salter at the time through Eddie Chambers. and had a piece of a print out in Passion. And Maud around this time had also organized a workshop for African, Caribbean, Asian women, and I met up with Nina Edge there as well. So it was a wonderful, exciting time because there was lots going on. We were showing, we were, working away, but I also then returned back to the Slade in '87 to teach lithography alongside Stanley Jones and Peter Daglish. And of course, around that time, also had the show at Horizon Gallery. So this takes me to two other exhibitions, and one was Let the Canvas Come to Life with Dark Faces, which was curated by Eddie Chambers and Nima Puvia Smith, who was a curator at Cartwright Hall in Bradford. And also the show organized by Eddie Chambers, which was Black People and the British Flag. And around this time, I'd also met up with Saeed, and you've seen the Crossing Black Waters exhibition here, which I haven't mentioned yet, which was organized by Panchayat. And again, Simrat and myself have a history with Panchayat. We were the two of the founding members alongside Shaheen, Shanti Thomas, and Alan D'Souza. So, so this brings me back to Black People and the British Flag. And this was a piece which we created for that, which was taking it a kind of looking at the Union Jack, the colors, and we call this trespassing because it was the way we kind of politically, socially, and as artists, we could interpret our kind of presence in Britain at the time, and the other things which was happening around us, really, which we don't really have time to go into. But this also leads me on to a one-person major show, which I had at Cartwright Hall in '94. Around this time, I was offered a residency at South Hill Park in Bracknell for 2 years. And I, around that time, was doing some visiting teaching, but which I kind of stopped doing and then just started giving a lot more time to collaborations with some of the art organizations I was working with. And this piece is called She Sowed the Seeds, and it has 108 print pieces in it. And it was very much inspired by my mother's embroidery, which came as part of her dowry. And so the colors are very much from this kind of pulkaris, which people would know, which are very much kind of dominant embroidery pieces made by women in Punjab. And alongside that, I also was commissioned to do a large dance floor, which was a collaboration with Shobi Gulati, who's a dancer. And that's the catalog which was produced. And I had a wonderful writing in it by Deanna Petherbridge. And so this dance floor was then used for lots of workshops and for school groups to come in and work on. So that was kind of a beginning of the time when I started collaborating with a lot more artists and with, and I must say that the regional museums up north showed a lot of our work. In fact, most of the exhibitions that we've talked about, apart from Horizon Gallery, the touring shows were like in Midlands and in Yorkshire and other places rather than London. This piece of work is called One and the Many, and this was commissioned by Nima. Now, Nima actually curated or collected the largest body of work by South Asian artists at Cartwright Hall. And it's one and the only. And it was amazing that she could actually do that. And I looked at the silver collection in the museum's collection and worked from that. So this is actually a monoprinted piece on canvas, which is done on 16 panels and then put together as one piece with a very faint circle going through it. You might be able to just see it. And this was actually shown, also selected by Sonia Boyce about 3 years ago, I think, for the London Arts Fair, because she was looking at the colors used by Rashid Arain. So it was really nice for it to be shown in London. So I'm just going to very quickly whiz through some of my projects, which I did with other groups. I was working a lot with dance companies, and this was a project with Academy in London, and working with students, involving students in creating spaces that were then used for dance and poetry and reading and music. And so it was beginning of my collaborations. I mean, for me, I think sharing a creative process became a much more interesting way of working, because the studio practice around this time had completely, in a way, there were no more showcases, there were no more invitations. I think the whole idea of curatorialship, before there were artist curators in some of the earlier shows, whereas I think in the late 90s and early 2000, I think the kind of curators took over in terms of what, and became very much a say in what was happening in art galleries. And somehow I think the artist curators fell back unless you kind of went into a research post to then organize shows. I think somehow the whole thing changed. But for me, I think you still have to pay your bills and you still have to keep your practice alive. So for me, I think I just latched onto the opportunities as an artist educator, as very much a collaborator, and that's where the work blossomed. So these are I've just put in a few projects of my art education projects, which were with organizations like Bow Arts in East London. And again, as I've said, the Academy. And I did a lot of regular work with organizations. And also this little project is very dear to my heart. I worked with an elderly group in Leamington Spa for many years, and I would turn up there every week and we would make different things. And here we've got, elderly women making ceramic tiles, and we actually made a coffee table. This is when it was still, so it was just amazing. And I made prints with them. We did embroideries, we did all kinds of things. And for me, it was, I think most of my projects were with marginal communities, and they were where I could speak the language and I could share my skills and yet feel very humble in those environments. And you were accepted within, so you didn't sort of perform in any way. And so these were some of the imagery created by women. So you could see these, just very simple motives from their kind of background. But also we did projects where they brought in their embroideries to share what they had done in their past when they were 16, 17, and getting their things ready for their, the bottom drawers, as we say. So yeah, and then after that, actually, I think this would be around 95 that I started seriously thinking about materials which were permanent and which could go outside in the built environment. And this was a project with young people in Slough. These were with young men mostly who used to hang around just smoking and drinking. And it was amazing that we could engage them to actually make concrete tiles and do this piece, which was almost, about 4 meters high. And that led me again to be working with concrete and working with schools where people brought in things which meant, which had a personal meaning for them. And these could be embedded in concrete. And then I'd make these huge, large panels. And this was in Bracknell, which was at the entrance to the school. So I've got, I think, quite many of these up and down the country in different schools. Yeah, and I must say that these were kind of inspired by Gaudi in the first instance, but I then went on to, you know, somehow almost create concrete, like you make dough in a kitchen, and handle it like ceramic, and you could actually work with all ages. And this particular project involved the whole school community. So I don't know how much time I've got. I'll just whiz through some of these projects now. And these are some, that was a collaboration with Christine Wilkinson, another a friend of mine that I'd worked with and shared a studio in Reading for many years. And again, another project with Saeed, which we worked with a community, well, about almost 20 different community groups in Leicester. And this was a 3-meter high roundel, which had enameled stainless steel panels, but also had a LED panel within it, which acted as a community information board. So the community could actually update it. And so we had Black History Month, we had poetry groups in Leicester who put in their work. And so it was quite amazing that we could make pieces which were interactive with the community. And and these are another project, which was a collaboration with architects. And so that was a piece in terrazzo. This was like welcome in different countries, in different languages. And that's another project which was done with the school in Abingdon, with Vale of White Horse. And this was sandblasted polished granite. So in the end, you can see the children here, after it arrived and it had been installed, they were peeling off the stencils, which then, which protects the granite before it's sandblasted. So I found a lot of kind of long-term collaborations really with fabricators, people who work with stone, and we worked together on many projects together. And so the work kind of, built on from there. This has poetry in the outside as well, which the children had put together. The inspiration was the local landscape and the river Ock that ran very near the school. So lastly, I've got a project which was done in East End of London. And I worked very closely with the women's group that I've from mid 2000 until, I worked with this group for almost 10 years. It's a Bangladeshi women's group, and we called ourselves Mohila Creations. And so they all did a bollard. Their designs were transferred onto bollards, which was inspired by the local landscape. So here what you've got the stencil covering. You can see the drawing on the far bollard in pencil, which they would have drawn, and then I would have cut around it, and then these were sandblasted. So we had 10 of these and this project was done with Bow Arts again and Tower Hamlets Council, and it was a regeneration project. And we also had 10 of these text in the paving, which was like feel good factor. And we had 200 of these, and we could only select 10, and I've just put in one of them. So in the end, my studio practice has always been there alongside whatever I've done outside. And I think this was the piece I sent to you, which is, if you remember the big print I did called She Sowed the Seeds at Cartwright Hall. I'm recycling that now. So I've been cutting it up because it was just sitting under my bed for many years. So I thought I better get it out, and I've been cutting it up and using it in other forms, because after all, we are all transitory. So in the end, what I've done is I've just put some text together, because Interworlds is looking at strategies. So I don't know how much time I've got, probably 3 more minutes or something. Anyway, this is something which you can look at later on anyway, because I've just looked at where my strength has come from. and where I think some of the ways in which perhaps the work that Shai is doing, how things can, some of the directions I feel, which could open up the scope for work of British Asian artists. So, which also means looking at some of the archives. I wanted to mention Panchayat that I was part of, but also Sada, which is now based at Birmingham Museum, and which has been extremely kind to me and got Alice to write an article about my work. And they're very much there to promote the work of first generation South Asian British artists. So I just put that as some questions, answers, conversations, and pointers. And just to think that I think we need to think holistically, where we actually make connections with other people across the lands and, through our different backgrounds to see how we can actually excel and grow from that. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Bhajan. That was a really thought-provoking presentation, and there's lots of scope for future discussion too. Thank you very much, it's wonderful. So our next speaker is Suki Chan. Suki Chan is an artist and film director, and she uses installation, moving image, photography and sound to explore our subjective perception of reality. Her films take audiences on an immersive journey, drawing the viewer into a cinematic elsewhere to investigate memory, belief and knowledge systems. Practice sits at the intersection of art and science, featuring dialogues with neuroscientists, psychologists, people living with dementia and blind and partially sighted people. Suki seeks out narratives that explore alternative ways of looking at the world and stories that challenge and destabilize our understanding of perception and of reality. Her passion is to transform people's perception and build empathy for other people's realities simultaneously. So over to you, Suki.
Thanks so much, Jasmine, for the introduction and also for the invitation to be part of this event. It's a brilliant opportunity for me to reflect on my practice spanning 2 decades. I simply wouldn't have done it otherwise. So thank you so much for the nudge. So as Jasmine said, I am an artist and filmmaker. I work with installation, moving image and sound. To explore our subjective perception of reality. My film takes the audiences on an immersive journey. And for me, I'm really interested to explore memory and subjectivity. I'm going to start by talking about my art practice over the past 20 years. What were the initial motivating questions for my early works? And how has this evolved over the years? What strategies do I have to sustain my practice whilst expanding my horizon and stay true to my interests? As I delve into the past, I'm going to draw on key works to show the progression of my ideas. Firstly, some background information about me. I was born here in this little village, in the New Territories in Hong Kong. It is also here that my filmic journey began 16 years ago. At the age of 6, my family and I immigrated to England. But my grandmother didn't come to the UK until many years later. And so in the interim, we would visit her as often as possible. And during my yearly and bi-yearly visits, I would notice many changes in the village. The villagers looked older each year that passed. The old house that we used to live in, that we left behind, became more and more overgrown and dilapidated. I think you might see my mouse. So this here, behind all the shrubs and the overgrown trees, this is our old house. My grandmother didn't live here. She lived in a newer house, but remained in the same village. This is what the house looked like a few years later. But this moment made me realize that a part of my family history was soon to disappear, and that inspired me to make my first Super 8 film, to try and capture this moment, this building before it fell into ruins. This was my first time to use time-lapse, a cinematography technique of taking a series of still images of the same frame at intervals over a period of time, and then playing the entire sequence rapidly. This technique reveals movements that are normally imperceptible and reminded me of my experience of the village over the years. The missing time frames, which enabled me to see the changes that the villagers just simply did not notice because they saw the environment and the people in the village every day. After this first film, I made a sequel, but this time I went further back in my family's history to explore a particular type of vernacular architecture that my father's ancestors would have lived in Guangdong province in China before they migrated to Hong Kong. The Hakka round earth roundhouse. Hakka literally translates as guest people and are a Han Chinese ethnic group known for their long migration history and their traditional architecture. In this film, I used the imagery of the murmurations of starlings as a metaphor for the diaspora, the scattering of people away from their original homeland. Their seasonal migration reminded me of my own journeys between the UK and Hong Kong. This is a still from interval 2. And to make the film, I actually stayed in this house for about 4 weeks across 2 trips. The early works were motivated by my interest in identity and belonging, having grown up in 2 cultures. And I was drawn to the landscapes of my childhood. At that time, I was intrigued about China and I wanted to explore it as my motherland, when Hong Kong became formally part of China again. As an avid traveler, I adopted a peripatetic approach during the first decade of my career. Towards the end of this phase, I felt a desire to broaden my horizon and explore other sites beyond my heritage that have been shaped by the mingling of different cultures. And about this time, I was invited by the British Council to travel to Istanbul for a project. And there I was inspired by the architectural palimpsest that I found. Spaces or sites that have multiple layers of identity. I filmed in Hagia Sophia, a Byzantium church that became a mosque and is now a museum. It was really strange seeing archangels juxtaposed with Islamic calligraphy. In the Golan Heights in Israel, I filmed in abandoned Syrian homes that retain the marks of their previous occupants alongside evidence of recent violence. When I moved back to London after a long residency in Manchester, I became drawn to the city and the often invisible people who patrol these high-rise office blocks long after the workers have gone home. These people who remain awake whilst the rest of the city sleeps. In this film, Sleep Walk Sleep Talk, the gatekeepers who we don't normally hear from, they ruminate on their aspirations for the future compared with their former lives. I also interviewed other types of people for Sleep Walk Sleep Talk, from commuters, skaters, and meditators. I wanted to understand how we relate to the urban environment and to what extent these architectural structures impact on our minds and behaviors. In the next decade, I traveled less, partly because I became a mother and also because I wanted to spend more time developing my collaborations with specific community groups in the UK. Blind and partially sighted people, another group who perhaps we don't normally hear from, who don't have a voice, and neuroscientists. I was intrigued to try and understand more about vision and perception. As a visual artist, at one point I realized I don't know anything about this, and that's nuts. I was also drawn to explore the micro architectures of the mind and to explore how different people see and experience the world differently. As the author Anne Nin said, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And so I made video installations that were interactive and tracked the viewer's eye gaze. And in this piece, I was able to reveal the trajectory of their eye gaze. Which part of the picture do they look at? Do they look at the foreground more or the background more? And it was really fascinating to find that the way that we read an image is both personal, but also cultural. After these works, I became more and more interested to explore alternative ways of looking at the world and stories that challenge our own interpretations of what reality is. In my extensive dialogues with neuroscientists, I learned how experiences of the world and of the self are actively generated by our brains. It's not a passive process. And after a chance conversation with a neuroscientist, Chris Frith, who said that individual bees are not conscious, but the swarm is, the seed for my new feature film was sown. Alongside these investigations, I went on mentoring schemes such as New Approaches run by Film London in 2017 to help me to learn new skills and cross over to the film industry. I wanted to explore what other avenues I could make and show films because I began to find the museum and gallery circuit restrictive. Subsequently, I was awarded the Flaming Productions Award from Film London, and this enabled me to make a significant leap in my practice, upscale my production values, and work with actors. And then in 2021, I was selected on the Women of Film and TV Mentoring Scheme, and there I broadened my horizon to learn about the film and TV industry and how to collaborate with others across this industry. These mentoring schemes have given me the confidence to step up to make my first feature, and I've been working on this project for the past 6 years. Conscious explores the strength and frailty of the human mind and brings together the personal stories of 3 women living with dementia and a neuroscientist. I always start my films with a question. So for me, what can we learn from a scientist and 3 women living with dementia about the nature of consciousness? What new stories can they tell us about ourselves and about our relationship with others? Through the lens of dementia, the film explores what it means to be a conscious self and what happens when we lose aspects of it. Just as there are many ways to be conscious, there are many ways to lose consciousness. Wendy Mitchell has been really inspiring for me because when she was diagnosed with dementia, she became an author, she became a writer. And since then, she has written 3 books. Annie Seth is the neuroscientist I am in close dialogue with. I interviewed many neuroscientists in the UK, and I chose Anil because his ideas about the conscious self really resonate with me. So his work challenges the idea that there is this single unified self that underlies all the different experiences that we have. So there is no essence of self or soul, depending on which belief system you might subscribe to. And that this continuity of self that we experience is an illusion. And I think these ideas resonate with me because of my own cultural background and beliefs. The self as an illusion has its roots in many Eastern and Western philosophies. But I think what's really exciting is that neuroscience is now supporting some of these ideas. And I think then we can now explore this area in a new way. So now let's watch the teaser for my film.
On a bad day, it's like a fog descends on the brain. My reality suddenly becomes a different reality. Familiar surroundings become unfamiliar and hazy. You really don't know what day it is, what time it is, what you're supposed to be doing. And on those days, I try and tell myself that it's not me, it's the dementia.
If anything, I feel life has become easier. I'm thankful to say. I'm not afraid. It seems odd to say that I've lost any fear I ever had. I think I probably did have some fear.
My vows were, in 1960, to love and to cherish until death us do apart. And I just felt I'd broken those vows. What it must be like for the person with dementia, if we only knew, it would make life easier.
Given what we know about the intimate dependency of the brain and consciousness, when your brain stops, you stop. But is this something to be afraid of? In a way, almost the opposite, because the thing about oblivion is there's nothing. Nothing to be frightened of.
Sorry about the slightly jumbled beginning. I was a little bit thrown when I saw Anil at the end. I was like, oh my goodness, I haven't kind of got to the beginning again. Thank you for listening.
May I clap? I totally loved the film. So thank you for sharing, even if it's a clip. I mean, I was totally touched. Sorry for butting in between. Over to you, Kristen.
Yeah, I'm just drawing things together and open and out. Thank you all for these amazing presentations. You've just gathered so much material and sight and sound and texture. And we're going to open up now to the questions, which I could open straight to the floor, or I can begin with one. I'm very happy to begin. And I'm aware, Alice, that you said one of your artists might be in the audience, and I can see that person in the audience. I'm delighted because one of the questions I wanted to kind of draw out has to do with that amazing artwork that you showed us with Nilofar's work. And I guess one of the things I was interested in across the three talks was the language developing in each of the practices. And I think, Bhajan, in your talk, you were talking about the development of this sort of symbolic language in your own practice, and you talked us through barriers, which was really interesting to see the barriers actually becoming almost ornament, and then the bollard, and kind of imprinted on public space. That was really exceptional. And Suki, you taking us through this longevity of your practice and moving filmically and imagistically through kind of cross-culture migration through the brain and the self as this kind of continuity of selves, which I loved. But yeah, I guess one of the things I was curious about was about the development of that language in relation to who you're speaking with and to, and because I was quite taken, Alice, when you were showing us Niloufer's work, that there seemed to be a number of audiences. There was the conceptual art movement, but then there were also really culturally specific and really important messages that were kind of coming through with salt and with the imagery. And that seemed to kind of inform the language developed, and likewise Bhajan with the communities, and Suki with your different explorations. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe it's the who you're speaking with, and how that kind of relates to perhaps this notion of the world, of the interworld. Yeah, that's probably too big, but yeah, more just who you're talking to.
Shall I go first? I think what's really interesting about that project, so Transition of Riches was part, as I said, part of a bigger visual arts festival. And really the audiences for that were incredibly diverse, it was hoped that the audiences for that festival were going to be very diverse, but it was initiated from the position, as I understand it, from Jaginda, that it was initiated from the position that South Asian artists of South Asian heritage weren't being shown in galleries as a kind of baseline, that maybe there was an exhibition here, there was a sense that, oh, the other story has happened, so we don't need to do that anymore. And Jaginda told me recently that one of the reasons why it ended up being so enormous was that as the project developed, more and more organizations joined because they didn't want to be the ones being left out. They didn't want to be the ones who were evidently not participating in this kind of celebration of South Asian culture and heritage, and that there was some, if not quite a lot, of political face saving, shall we say, taking place. So your question about audiences is, well, there's the whether or not an artist makes work for an audience or for themselves, I think is really open question. In actual fact, I wasn't able to show an image of it, but another aspect of Niloufer's installation was that she included photographs of a number of people, a number of women who she had collaborated with and done interviews with about their experiences of partition, whether that's personal experiences from 1947 or generational memory. So there was that aspect to the project as well. So there's the artists, who they're working with or who they think may or may not see the work, and whether or not that's an element of their thinking when they're making. And then there's the institutional aspiration of widening participation and diversifying audiences, and why the institution may or may not have wanted to participate in a festival of South Asian visual culture. And yeah, there are all sorts of political reasons why they took part. I think some of those institutions, like there was Birmingham, but there was also in Warsaw, Stafford, all over the place. I think Birmingham in particular took that remit quite seriously, and they had a South Asian curator working on that exhibition, and so they were very conscious of reflecting the constituency of Birmingham, actually. And I think that it's significant that later on the Sada archive has gone to Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. So I would suggest, I mean, I don't know, I have to do a bit more research on this, but I think the beginnings of that, of Birmingham taking its local audiences and its local South Asian constituencies seriously, maybe started with Transition of Riches.
Yeah, brilliant. That's it. Excellent.
More research to do.
More. Yeah.
I would like to say something. For me, hello there. For me, it was a personal journey. I'd come out of a family on both my maternal and my paternal sides of the family, blocks of the family, who were refugees from partition. My paternal side had been forced into Europe, and my maternal side had been forced into Pakistan. So I grew up with 2 generations on either side who had been forced into exile or forced into lands that they didn't belong to in reality, but had been then made their homes there. Whether they actually became their homes was questionable. So I had a lot of unanswered questions, which they wouldn't necessarily respond to because they had been traumatized. And so I grew up with their trauma. Their trauma became my trauma as well. And I set out on this journey to answer that. And I don't know if I've succeeded, but it started a thread of thought that subsequently was to reflect on a lot of my work in different forms. So that's what I would like to say.
Yeah.
Now, whether it was done for an institution, yes, I don't think I was even aware of the fact at that point that Asian art was not going to be looked at, you know. I certainly don't think I was, or even Bhajan, whom I know from that period, was aware of it, that nobody was going to look at our works. And this still goes on. It's not it's not a problem for me. Hasn't been a problem for me for a long time now. I continue working. I work with a lot of performance, and I do it on the street, and I'm quite happy with my own progression of thought, you know. It's not relevant to me anymore whether somebody looks at it or doesn't look at it.
Yeah.
And I think that answers some of Alice's question, are we working for ourselves? Yes, we are working for ourselves, but we are also working for a larger community or a larger transnational world, because we are part of it. And if we are overlooked, it's not a major issue, no. Because we are answering our own questions as well. And I mean, this is all commonplace. Artists get overlooked all the time. You know, there are plenty of artists in the world. How many do you want to look at or can look at?
Yeah, but that's really interesting to hear that kind of almost like an intergenerational communication, and then a way of kind of communicating that trauma, which I was kind of interested in the artworks, how much you're using materials to communicate. You know, so you've got the text, but the text isn't, you know, prosaic. It's quite poetic. So finding these ways of communicating that trauma through these other means.
Well, I think you can visit somebody's trauma, but you can't. How much you can imbibe it in yourself is a complex question. But then you, as you say, you know, you can metaphorically represent it, because it's a representation rather than a representation. I mean, it's a very troubling thing to do, you know, visiting people's traumas or living through them. very disturbing. And I certainly paid a price for it when I worked on the civil war in Bangladesh. In fact, I managed to throw a pot of hot water on my leg and I had to be hospitalized because I was listening to all these various encounters I had with many, many people, you know, with whatever trauma that had been inflicted on them through a civil war. So it can, you know, it affects the artist as well. An artist who's coming from a country that belonged to them, but was no more part of it, you know, and the shock of hearing or seeing or not having seen because it has been diluted or dismissed or removed from your own culture, you know. So there are many layers to that aspect of visiting. It's about visitation more than anything else.
Nilofer, it's
sorry. Yes.
Go ahead, Nilofer, sorry.
I beg your pardon. It's about visiting. I lived within my own family on two generations, both my maternal and paternal, as I've already remarked. And I was visiting their trauma, or they were visiting it on me, you know. I constantly felt that kind of darkness in their lives, although they had shifted spaces, but they carry it for the rest of their lives. I remember my aunt saying to me, because they were forced into Austria, you know, they were in Austria when the Second World War happened. So she said to me, I carry it within myself constantly, you know. And then she moves and finally moves back and lives in Lahore, you know, in Pakistan. So there was a kind of continuous change of culture, movement, displacement, never occupying a space. And I feel that the same about myself. I've moved, I know, led this life where I'm constantly on the move, you know, and I never feel, I no more feel I belong to a certain place. And again, it doesn't bother me. But the only thing bothers me that, the only thing that really bothers me that I'm Asian and I would like to be seen as that, you know. Whatever happens, I come from a culture or a place which has been and will continue to be traumatized because, you know, that neocolonialism continues. It's not about just colonialism, but neocolonialism continues. Structures are not formed. Governments don't gel. I mean, it's just happened to us a few days ago, you know. And I know what happened. You know, I know I've grown up with it all my life. And then I come here, I don't quite belong here. I know that. So then what do? You know, I have to find a niche somewhere to exist. So I exist. Yes. And I have to carry on with my work. So I do it. Sometimes, of course, I get cross, very angry. When that's not reflected in what my thought is. You know, I often hear some of my friends say, one of my friends who's from Austria says to me, I'm a Londoner. So I said, but you're never a Londoner. You might live here all your life, but they'll never accept you as a Londoner. And then she'll tell me, but I could never feel like that in any other town of the UK. But I don't feel like a Londoner living here. I'm constantly told. Somebody asks me after speaking to me for a while, says, but tell me, where do you really come from? You know, so then I say, okay, South London is not my home. So it's okay. It's okay.
Thank you for sharing, Nilofer. It's interesting to hear about your research because it's very closely related to mine as well. So I'm also coming from a family which migrated from Pakistan to India. And and that's part of my research practice is dealing with intergenerational trauma. And while listening to Alice's presentation, it was really interesting because she spoke about Shashi Mehra, and Shashi Mehra is my mother's name. And she's from Peshawar, and that's where my father came from. So there were all these things which is going on in my head, and I was like, totally get what's happening, and it's deja vu in so many ways, you know. And yeah, it's a pain that you carry through, you know, no matter where you live or where you belong. And home is never one place, you know. It's always moving from one city to another, one home to another, one country to another, and you're always seeking for something which you cannot identify. So yeah, it was lovely hearing you speak. Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you.
It would be really interesting as well if particularly Bhajan and Suki, if you could expand on how you've negotiated exhibition venues, such as exhibitions in traditional galleries or public site-specific work in public spaces, for example. That would be interesting to hear about.
Would you like me to go first, or do you want to jump in?
Go for it. Go for it.
I think I look for the venue that I would like to show in, of which there are, of course, many. But then I look at their curation and see if they might be interested in what I'm doing. So and then you have a conversation with the curator, and hopefully they're interested. It's difficult because it's how you approach them. You know, often if you email them, people ignore you because they receive so many requests to show, you know, solo shows or whatever. They're just bombarded with requests. So it's really, really difficult. But if I think about the last two shows that I've been in, the two solo shows, the one at Blue Coat, that came about because I was part of a group screening in Liverpool, and I was invited to go up, and the organisers had a really nice dinner afterwards, and I happened to sit next to Brian, who is the creative director of Blue Coat. And he asked me, what am I doing at the moment? And then I told him what I was doing. And he said, oh, this sounds really interesting. Can you get in touch? Because, you know, we might be interested to partner with you on this project. And lo and behold, I got in touch, and then this thing grew. So initially it was with the facilitation end of Blue Coat. So it was more about the outreach work and working with Dementia Community Group. And then I think I was one of the few artists that did that. I then went from the facilitation end of Blue Coat to the exhibition end of Blue Coat. And that's when I spoke to Marianne. But Marianne was someone that was very interested in adjusting that underrepresentation of women. And I knew that within the last few years, she has given solo shows to women artists. So I kind of felt like this is a good fit for me. This is a good venue. And she was very responsive. And then obviously I had the solo show last year. And then with Danielle Arnaud Gallery in London, I've known Danielle for a while, but I didn't feel right for me to ask her. So I got my gallerist at the time to nudge her and say, hey, can we have, and I mean, Tintype is no longer operating. So that's why it was fine for Teresa to ask Danielle, would you give Suki a solo show? And Danielle obliged kindly. But it is awkward asking someone, because again, you know that, you know, if you go and see them at the private view or networking events, you can't really just go, oh, can I have a solo show, please? Or this is my work, you know, so you've got to kind of gently approach it and not be, you know, too aggressive in there to try and grab that show. But I mean, I don't feel that I necessarily have a lot of visibility, although I have solo shows here and there. I'm never in the major group shows, in the survey shows. I'm often not curated with other artists. I'm often on my own.
You can't go at curators with like a sledgehammer. It's all done in different stages.
It is, and it also depends if you fit in with the ideas that they want to talk about within the show. They will have an agenda, or whether you're the person to bring forth some of those associations or ideas or not. And I think because I don't like to pigeonhole myself, then I think sometimes it can be a little bit hard to situate my work. Do you talk about the work, or do you talk about my identity? And if you look at my work, then it's not necessarily explicitly about my identity. For instance, it's not about my experience of being a Chinese woman living in the UK. So it's you know, so if you're after that kind of work, you won't be going to me. So I understand some of these challenges of why I know that I'm not included in the shows, but then again, I follow my interests. So I make the work that I want to make. I think that's also why I've decided to look at what other avenues there are for showing my work. So then I'm not just in the museum and gallery circuit, because I think that can be restricted because you're waiting for curators to give you that space to show your work. Whereas I'm more of the person that likes to create my opportunities rather than wait for them to land.
Great. See, we have a hands up.
Jasmine, did you want Bhajan to come in before we bring in Pierce? Just because I could see.
Yeah, very quickly. I think I've been out of the gallery circuit for a long time, and I've kind of stopped looking in that direction unless you're invited for a particular show. But I think with public art, it's a completely different way of working, because you, even if you get invited for a commission, there is always the consultation with the communities, and you have to, there is a brief and you actually respond to the brief. So, you know, it's a process which goes over a period of time before you actually get to a point where the work is shared in any particular space, whether it's temporary or permanent. So I think it's fulfilling in a way because you are working with other people, you're collaborating with other people. And so I think that's the short answer. And each project has its own merit and its own way of working, and you know, not set of problems, but challenges, really, how you work through those. So I think that's kind of my answer to that.
Great. And it's always interesting considering about different ways artists can create their own opportunities through galleries or also in museums as well. So okay, there's a hands up in the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, because Alice sort of sketched out how there was a network of emerging curators and exhibition organisers from the 80s around South Asian artists, and Bhajan also then, you know, talked about some key collaborations for her and the earlier phase of her career. So I wonder if maybe it was an opportunity for Suki. Could you say what was around more specifically for as a British Chinese artist when you came out of Goldsmiths and Chelsea in the 2000s? Did you find, is there a similar network that you felt able to engage with, or were there other key curators that helped you know, you felt promoted you? And maybe if Bhajan, if you could maybe say something a bit about from the situation that you started on in the 80s to now, do you feel the level of support has improved or has become more insightful, or, you know, how things might have changed for the better or not?
Okay, so when I came out of Goldsmiths, I didn't have a network of East Asian artists or curators to support me. I didn't know any. I think the organization that supported me was the Chinese Art Centre based in Manchester. That organization then became the Centre for Contemporary Chinese Art. And sadly, it's been taken down by a few of my contemporaries and friends, and I never really understood what was going on, because actually that was the only organization that really I felt supported me in my career. So It's interesting because I think, and I've been thinking about this, what makes us different? What makes East Asian artists different from, say, some of the other ethnic groups that band together and they really support each other in their practice? I think often when it's successful, it's because there's been something within their collective history, like a trauma, that really, really brings them together. And so there is that solidarity. Whereas I think because Chinese artists, China is such a huge country, and anyway, I'm from Hong Kong, so then there is that slightly a strange relationship with China. Any of the PhD students that are coming from, say, the mainland China, and they're writing about Chinese art, they're not going to look at British Chinese artists. They're going to be looking at the mainland Chinese artists. So I'm often excluded because I just don't fit that vision, that bill. So yeah, it can be quite frustrating in that I know where the limitations are and where the barriers are, where the ceiling is because of certain geographical and historical reasons. Yeah, and what was it like for you, Bhajan, when you came out of that 80s, 90s period? What was it? Yeah, what kind of barriers did you feel?
Yeah, I think a lot of stuff kind of stopped around end of 90s. It was from mid 80s till mid 90s, I think Alice would talk about that, but there was a lot more happening. And I think there were overall changes, I think, with government and the funding possibilities and galleries closing and Arts Council priority changes and in terms of where they channel their funding. So a lot of those kind of voluntary actions, those stopped. And also, I think, we had got to a point where I think you kind of stopped looking out and you were looking at what other opportunities there were. And I think that was largely the reason why my work kind of went more towards public art and rather than from much more towards the studio practice always happened, but seeking galleries as such. So I was looking more at commissions and other opportunities. And so I think those became my supportive structures, including organizations which had education and learning as part of their, very much their remit. But I think we still are really lucky in this country because we've still got that public funding strand where education still, I think, although I know it's gone up and down a lot, but with museums and galleries, they always had sections where because they want to develop their audiences, I think there was still that opening to bring the communities in. That's one way you can bring families and children in. And so that there was still that little outlet where you could kind of fit in and very much talk about your own practice. And I still do that in schools or wherever I go there as an artist, as a practicing artist, rather than work through school curriculums if I can help it. It just means that children actually get to interact with a living artist because they do look at work of a lot of dead artists all the time. So I think that's one and really, I think when you go to places like Spain or Germany or Italy, you do find that maybe I don't know about Germany, but I do know about Spain because I've spent a lot more time there, that those strands just do not exist where artists actually have to really rely on developing their work commercially. Whereas I think we here still are very fortunate with public funding. So, and of course, there were always organizations that were willing to collaborate, like the Academy and other organizations which have always worked with artists. So I think that's the kind of area that I just worked in and expanded, and somehow the work developed through those strands because I had the curiosity of materials and enjoyed working with different materials. So somehow it grew through that, and later on partnerships with architects and, you know, through local authorities. Again, of course, with the recession of 2008, a lot of regeneration projects stopped, because before that there was always the percent for the arts. In most building projects, there was the percent for the arts, where the organizations develops were obliged to bring in an artist and work with communities to have some presence of community kind of input into those projects. But unfortunately, that's all dried up now. So, and then the worst, I think the last act was the austerity measures, where most of these departments within local councils disappeared, like in Reading and other places where the arts development sections all disappeared because they were the first to be axed by the councils. So I think most of those projects, which were before in the 90s, they just disappeared. There were no more community projects. A lot of youth centers shut down. And now I think people are actually feeling the pinch, because those, you know, before those young people could actually come into the youth centers, and they were, you know, periods where there were festivals and other ways that people could get involved. And I think they're now again trying to sort of start those things, because they've been huge. We know there's huge sections, you know, concerning health, and COVID has actually shown us that how the arts are so important for well-being of communities, and they're trying to link that much more with health and hospitals now. So I think things have changed along the way. Yeah.
Great, and it would be interesting if you could also expand on any factors to do with being an artist and a female artist as well. That would be interesting to if you could talk more about that. And
I think being a female artist is being an artist. The application of gender is often an imposition, depending how you have circumnavigated through life. But then there's the other aspect, is what you see of female cultures, female lives around you, and how they have evolved, whether acrimoniously, whether with a gentler approach, forcefully, whatever. And then you look through it. That is, if you are, of course, if that's the subject matter you have, which I often have as my subject matter. The expression of it, articulating the expression of it, how complex that is, and its representation, because in many cultures, I mean, I'm not talking just specifically of a Western culture. A Western culture is very different from an Eastern culture. And having lived in both two cultures, I see the differences, I see the common ground, and I see also who manages to negotiate through it. There's then become who's passive, who's assertive, and where. You know, when I heard about or read about the Me Too movement in the West, I felt disassociated from it because it didn't represent me. But at the same time, it represents me, because if a woman gets raped, like we had here near my home on Clapham Common, she's still a woman who was raped, you know, who was forcibly violated. and humiliated and then disposed of with in that macabre manner. And at once I empathize with it, because that's who I am, a female, and she's a female. But I know that women's movements, they call it the feminist movement here, of course, but over my part of the world, it's still early days, they have adopted feminist thought, but it's still the women's movement, very much like it would have been at the time of or prior to partition. It's evolving at a different pace, because a segment of society manages to liberate themselves, but the larger group is not liberated in the same way and is constantly violated in a manner which is physical, really largely physical and mental, or verbally abusive or whatever. So it's very different from here, because the state allows or demands that it's ingrained in governmental policies to give women an equal opportunity, even though if it's not necessarily equal, we may not be paid in the same manner. So I see the difference of the imbalances that exist. And then there are, of course, ethnographic groups which have matriarchal society, have matrilineal constructs, and their attitudes are totally different and quite unique in these tribal societies. For example, I was living and working in Afghanistan, and I was always given this impression that their women are subjugated and confined. But that wasn't the case. They may live in the confines of their four walls often, not always. They're very, very militant and assertive. So we have very different views all the time from different cultures about who we are, or how people objectify us in many ways and reduce us to being passive. That's not the case. I think I've said enough.
I think following that from that, I think for me as an artist with two young children, I often feel that pressure. And I think the pressure is from two factors. One, from my cultural background, it's expected that, and I mean as a Chinese woman, it's expected that I give up my career to bring up children. It wouldn't be my husband, it would be me giving up my practice. And then on another factor is that financially, because I don't have a steady income. So then that's another factor that then pressurizes me to take on more of the childcare responsibilities. So I think that the time that you have available to make your art decreases as you get older. So it's juggling the two. And often I find, is it family or is it film? It's like it's one, and you can't do both. It's very, very difficult. But I juggle it anyway. But I think I'm just very, very aware that these are the barriers that a lot of women are facing, and particularly Southeast women. We have that culture where we are the primary caregivers. So there is that expectation that we should be doing it. And it isn't shared. It often isn't shared. So whereas I think in a Western society, I think sometimes the man, takes on 50% and it's kind of okay. But in my tradition, it's very, very rare. But luckily, my husband's quite supportive. But I know that his wider family isn't supportive. So it's often, why is Suki doing this? Why is she going off there? And, so it becomes a negotiation. It isn't just, you and your partner's ideas. It's your community around you that is giving their thoughts and expectations that then kind of pressurizes you. So it's very complex.
And that, thank you, Suki. I think that resonates with all of us. I think at some point in our lives, we all have gone through that and perhaps continue to go through that even as of now. And it's a challenge, but I think we as women, we kind of deal it rather very successfully. At least I like to believe that. So on that note, I'd like to thank all of you, Bhajan, you, Dr. Correia, Kristen, Sana, Jasmine. It was wonderful having all of you on this platform with us, sharing your thoughts, opinions, your time, your artwork. Yeah, and it was, yeah, I'm taking something very precious back with me right now. I can't explain what it is, but I'm going to be in touch with you later on, hopefully over the email. So yeah, thank you so much. And Jasmine, would you like to say something?
So much for your wonderful presentations and really informative dialogues as well. And it's so interesting hearing all your ideas about the work you've done, and also about your research to do with Asian British art as well. And I look forward, as likewise with Bindu, to continuing the dialogues and conversations as likewise too. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming along as well. And a recording will be available soon. And the next Shai, Asian British Art event, will be with Michelle Williams Gamaker at the South London Gallery. That would be an in-person event as well, and in conversation with her. So it'd be great, and if you can make that would be wonderful as well.
Yes, yeah, you could. If you want to book it online, the event is through Eventbrite and on the South London Gallery website. So thank you so much. Thank you. We really look forward to further communications. This is an unfinished conversation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's brilliant.
Bye.